You have to be tough as a damn boot to be good, because you have to stand your ground when you need to stand your ground, and you have to be able to say no when it's time to say no, and you have to mean it. And so then you have to think and plan strategically so that when you're going to say no, you can mean it and it will stick. You know, and that takes a certain amount of integrated malevolence, I would say. And once it's integrated, it's not malevolence, it's strength. It's strength of character. It's the ability to stand your ground. And you have to cultivate that. And you cultivate that, at least in part, by telling the truth. And so you take your place in the world as a decent person and as a decent citizen, and you play the hierarchical game properly. And that is to stand up straight with your shoulders back. It's like the world's an onslaught. You've got the tyranny of culture to deal with. You've got the catastrophe of nature. You've got your own damn malevolence and ignorance, right? All coming at you, plus the incredible, complicated, indeterminate potential of the future. That's all coming at you, and it's all your responsibility. And you can cringe away from it and be afraid of it and be victimized by it and be bitter and cynical about it. And no wonder, because it can be painful. Or you can turn around and you can say, man, bring it on, because there's more to me than there is to the catastrophe. And this is what I discovered from looking at what I looked at. I looked at the darkest things I could look at, really, for 30 years. I was really a lot of fun to be around, I can tell you. I looked at the darkest things that I could think of, right? Not only what happened in Auschwitz and what happened in the Gulag, but personal issues. You know, it's like I wasn't so much interested in the totalitarians as a group. I was interested in the people who undertook the terrible acts that the totalitarians required. You know, the people who, I was just rereading Ordinary Men, and it was a story about a police battalion in Poland that trained ordinary policemen to take naked pregnant women out into the fields and shoot them in the back of the head. It takes a lot of training, by the way, before you can bring yourself to do that. And you aren't the same person by the end of it. It's pretty goddamn horrific. You know, and I was trying to figure out, what would it be like to be that person? Because we are that person. And then what would it be like to not be that person, right? To refuse to do that, to not participate in that. You know, and what I discovered by making that totalitarian proclivity personal was that there's more to us than there is to the horror. As nature is, bent on our destruction, bad as culture is, tyrannical and bloody, back as far as you can look, as malevolent as you are in the darkest part of your heart, and that's plenty malevolent, the possibility that's within you that can well up, the courage and the truth and the ability and the skill and the willingness to set things right, if you are willing to set them right, is more powerful than all of that. And so it's so interesting. It was proof for me of an old saying I read from Carl Jung. It's an alchemical motif, in stir qualinus inventur, which is what you most want to be found will be found where you least want to look, essentially. And it's so interesting because it means that if you're willing to turn around and to stand up, say, and stand up straight and face the darkness, like fully, what you discover at the darkest part is the brightest light. And that's something that's so much worth discovering, because there's going to be terrible darkness in your life. And it's going to make you cynical and bitter. And it could easily be that you're just not looking at it enough. Because if you looked at it enough and you didn't shy away and you brought everything you had to bear on it, you'd find that there was more to you than there was to the horror. You know, I watched my father-in-law. I'll end with this. And you know, you don't know, because you're not bringing your A game to the table with all that cynicism and bitterness and resentment and willful blindness and avoidance. Maybe you're playing at 60%. It's not good enough, because there's too much of what's bad for 60% to be good enough. It's like you need 90% or 95% or 100%. When about 15, 20 years ago, my mother-in-law developed frontal temporal dementia, which I wouldn't recommend. You know, it's one of those degenerative neurological diseases like Alzheimer's, and those bloody things like they're in the top echelon of awful. You know, you watch a person deteriorate before your eyes. It's a lengthy, lengthy death. And it was slow. And her husband, he lived in this little town that I grew up in, about 3,000 people. And he was quite a character, man. Everybody knew him. I bought him a Foghorn Leghorn t-shirt once, because that's kind of what he was like. He was loud and sort of bombastic, but he stood up straight, I can tell you. And he played the fool a little bit, mostly for the amusement of people, but he was no damn fool. And I always admired him and liked him. And the feeling was mutual, thank God, since I married his daughter. And, you know, he drank a lot with his crazy friends up in northern Alberta, and he wasn't at home a lot because he was working a lot. And you know, he was kind of a party animal about town, but a good businessman and a good man. And then his wife got sick, and they moved to another town. And, you know, he took care of her for like 15 years. It was unbelievable as she deteriorated, you know, and she got more desperate to have him around, and her love for him never went away. Even as she lost herself almost completely, she would always light up when he came into the room, you know. And he took care of her right till within weeks of her death. He had to finally put her in an old folks' home because he was no longer strong enough to lift her up from the chair. And we interacted with him a lot, you know, because we were trying to help him figure out how to cope. And we had signs put up in the house, electronic signs that would tell her when he was leaving, so that she would know where he went. And we had recordings in the bathroom so that she knew what to do when she went into the bathroom. And we tried to do everything we could to not make this absolutely bloody, atrocious experience complete hell. And he participated the whole way, you know, and it was really something to see. It was really it left me with a tremendous sense of admiration for him, but not just for him, but for people who can do that, you know. And if there was a new decline, he took it on, and he didn't complain about it, and he tried to do what he could, you know. And like, it was no picnic, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't hell. And then we were all gathered around the deathbed, my wife's mother's deathbed, and the family was there, and they got along pretty well, you know. And her sister's a palliative care nurse, and the other one's a pharmacist, and none of them are particularly afraid of illness and death. You know, they're a pretty tough group. And so, you know, they made sure their mother's lips were wet while she was no longer eating or drinking, and tried to make her comfortable. And they're around the deathbed, and they were kind of getting along, you know. It wasn't Family Feud at mother's death time, and that was kind of nice. And she died, and that was that. But it wasn't just that, because the fact that the family had coped with it well and nobly and honorably, I would say, brought them together. They were closer afterwards than they were before. And they all had more respect for their father. And then in the old folks' home, he met another woman who had a husband there who had Alzheimer's, and they got to know each other, you know. And he died after a while, and she died after a while, and then a few months later they started going out, and then eventually they had a relationship, and now they live together. And so he gained something. Like, it wasn't that he replaced what he lost, you know what I mean? Because he still has pictures of his wife up in his house, and she was the love of his life, and that's not going away. But, you know, his family respected him more, and everybody pulled together more, and it wasn't hell at the deathbed, it was just tragedy, and the family pulled together more. And that was a good example of how you can extract at least a certain amount of light out of what's dark, even at a personal level. And it's worth asking yourself. It's like, drop what you're doing that's foolish, that you know is foolish, and pick an aim that's worthwhile, you know, to make things better for yourself, like you're worth taking care of, like you're worth something, you know, and to surround yourself with people who believe the same, and who are rejoicing in your accomplishments and unhappy when you fail, right? And you're comparing yourself to your accomplishments of yesterday and not to someone else's today, so that you're not jealous and bitter. And you put your own house in order so that you're not cursing the world when some of its disarray might be your fault. And you're trying to pursue something meaningful, and you're doing your best to tell the truth, and all of that. And then you see what happens. Who the hell are you? You know, you think you're a miracle of some bloody bizarre sort. We've been around for 3.5 billion years. You know, every single one of your relatives propagated successfully. And here you are, against all possible odds, in this world of hell in some sense, and bitterness and tyranny and malevolence. And yet, God only knows what's inside you, this capacity for consciousness, the capacity to confront potential and to turn it into something good. That's us, man. That's the Western story. That's the individual as the cornerstone of the state. That's our responsibility, and it really is who we are.
Today is the beginning of the rest of your life, and it can be very frightening. It's a new world out there. It's a mean world out there, and you only live once. So do what you feel passionate about. Take chances professionally. Don't be afraid to fail. There's an old IQ test, was 9 dots, and you had to draw 5 lines with a pencil within these 9 dots without lifting the pencil. The only way to do it was to go outside the box. So don't be afraid to go outside the box. Don't be afraid to think outside the box. Don't be afraid to fail big, to dream big. But remember, dreams without goals are just dreams, and they ultimately fuel disappointment. So have dreams, but have goals. Life goals, yearly goals, monthly goals, daily goals. I try to give myself a goal every day. Sometimes it's just to not curse somebody out. Simple goals, but have goals. And understand that to achieve these goals, you must apply discipline and consistency. In order to achieve your goals, you must apply discipline, which you have already done, and consistency every day, not just on Tuesday and miss a few days. You have to work at it every day. You have to plan every day. You've heard the saying, we don't plan to fail, we fail to plan. Hard work works. Working really hard is what successful people do. And in this text, tweet, twerk world that you've grown up in, remember, just because you're doing a lot more doesn't mean you're getting a lot more done. Remember that. Just because you're doing a lot more doesn't mean you're getting a lot more done. Don't confuse movement with progress. My mother told me, she said, yeah, because you can run in place all the time and never get anywhere. So continue to strive, continue to have goals, continue to progress. Number 3, you'll never see a U-Haul behind a hearse. I'll say it again. You'll never see a U-Haul behind a hearse. I don't care how much money you make, you can't take it with you. The Egyptians tried it. They got robbed. That's all they got. You can't take it with you. And it's not how much you have. It's what you do with what you have. We all have different talents. Some of you will be doctors, some lawyers, some scientists, some educators, some nurses, some teachers. Yeah, okay. Some preachers. The most selfish thing you can do in this world is help someone else. Why is it selfish? Because the gratification, the goodness that comes to you, the good feeling that I get from helping others, nothing's better than that. Well, 1 or 2 things, but nothing's better than that. Not jewelry, not big house I have, not the cars, but it's the joy. That's where the joy is, in helping others. That's where the success is, in helping others. Finally, I pray that you put your slippers way under the bed tonight, so that when you wake up in the morning, You have to get on your knees to reach them. And while you're down there, say thank you for grace. Thank you for mercy. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for wisdom. Thank you for parents. Thank you for love. Thank you for kindness. Thank you for humility. Thank you for peace. Thank you for prosperity. Say thank you in advance for what's already yours. That's how I live my life. That's why I am, one of the reasons why I am today. Say thank you in advance for what is already yours. True desire in the heart for anything good is God's proof to you, sent beforehand to indicate that it's yours already. I'll say it again. True desire in the heart, that itch that you have, whatever it is you want to do, that thing that you want to do to help others and to grow and to make money, that desire, that itch, that's God's proof to you, sent beforehand already to indicate that it's yours. And anything you want good, you can have. So claim it. Work hard to get it. When you get it, reach back. Pull someone else up. Each one, teach one. Don't just aspire to make a living. Aspire to make a difference.
What's the keys to building confidence so that you're attracting
Well,
what you want?
Look, I read some of your biographical history before we talked today, and you tell a story about being picked last.
Mm-hmm.
And then you compensated for that.
Yes.
Now, Alfred Adler, by the way, the psychoanalyst, the associate of Freud, built his whole theory around compensation of that sort. Inferiority complex plus compensation. But it's adaptive, right? Like, you got picked last, it embarrassed the hell out of you.
Yep.
So what did you do? You decided that is not going to be me
Never
anymore.
again.
Right.
Never again.
Okay,
Yes.
now you did say, that you adopted a maybe too, inflexible model of what it meant to be masculine as a consequence. But when I read that, I thought, yeah, but still, fair enough. It wasn't, the new you that you adopted wasn't optimal in all possible manners, but it was definitely improvement over the previous you.
Exactly. I wasn't picked last again, that's for sure.
Right. Well, exactly. Okay. So the first thing I would say is that if you feel insecure and less and ashamed and all of that you have to take stock. And look, I have an exercise online at selfauthoring.com. There's 3 exercises there. One helps you write about the past, one about the present, and one about the future. The present authoring program helps you assess your faults and your virtues. Okay, well, if you have some faults and you feel insecure and inferior because of that, well, you should. Now, it shouldn't be so much that you're crippled by it and unable to take action. You shouldn't be beating yourself into the ground because you're not everything you could be, because no one is. And if you beat yourself into the ground, then you can't get up and improve. But you have to differentiate. It's like, okay, to what degree am I being hard on myself, counterproductively critical, hearing the voice of my too harsh and angry father in my head,
Right.
Adopting inappropriate stereotypical representations of masculine competence? How much of my self-criticism is ill-advised? Fair enough. And you want to deal with yourself with a certain amount of care. But then along with that, there's fix your weaknesses. If you're ashamed of being ignorant, you're showing up at a party because, you claim to knowledge that you don't have and someone exposes you. Well, you can be angry at them, and you probably will, but they've actually done you a favor. They pointed out an inadequacy is a pathway that you can travel down, right? A recognized inadequacy is, it's such a gift in some sense, if it's accurate. Because you think, well, what should I do? What should I do with my life? That's a real complicated question. Oh, here's an inadequacy. Excellent. You have a goal now. Rectify it. Now, you still have to think strategically and figure out how to rectify it and do it step by step. But Carl Rogers, the psychotherapist, pointed out that the person, for therapy to be successful, the person has to want to change. So they have to have recognized that they have a problem. If someone is mandated by the court to attend therapy, it's very difficult for the therapist to convince them that they have a problem. Once you're convinced you have a problem, it's like, away you go. You know, I know it's still technically difficult. It requires discipline and all of that. There's no magic solution, but if you're plagued by feelings of inferiority, you should rectify the most obvious inferiorities. I would say that you have to rectify an inadequacy when it's clearly an impediment to your goal, or you have to shift goals. But if you're shifting goals because of an inadequacy related impediment, then you have to ask yourself, is your desire to shift the goal reliable, or are you just taking the easy way out? Right. You can protect yourself by picking a different goal that's more difficult. That's a good mental hygiene practice, because sometimes you should switch goals rather than rectifying inadequacies. But you can fool yourself then, and that's not good.
And if someone is goalless, lazy, unmotivated, not sure what they want to do, what would be a few key steps to get started to turn their life around, or to find the motivation for something greater than where they're at?
Well, I think a fair bit of that's probably to be found in, you can find it in shame, you can find it in guilt, you can find it in conscience, you can find it in anger, you can find it in interest and engagement and beauty. There's lots of pathways. If you're angry about something in the world, well, you know, that's an indication that that's in some sense your problem, right? It's speaking to you in a moral sense. This shouldn't be that way. Well, maybe you're the person who should do something about it in some manner. Maybe it'll take your whole life to figure out how to do that. But it's bothering you for a reason. So the negative emotions can be a pathway to transformation. I'm not trying to romanticize them. They can crush you completely and leave you with nothing, right? For sure. And they can go badly astray. But shame, that's a good one. What am I ashamed of? Well, can you fix any of that? I'm going to work on these things that I'm ashamed of. And just see, like, does my life improve enough so that I'm not so bitter about it now, or I'm not so hopeless about it now? And my experience has generally been that works. It works. And then some of it's practical knowledge too. It's like you can get a really long way with very small changes, incremental changes, micro habit changes. So aim low.
Don't have big goals or big transformations.
Well, you can, but the problem with a big goal is that it's daunting enough so that it might paralyze you, and there's a high probability of failure. And so imagine that you're your own child. Okay, now imagine you love this child and you would like him, we'll say him because it's you and I talking, to succeed. Now you have an ideal for this child. You would like him to grow up to be the best he can be, better than you, the best man he can be. That's what you want for your son. If the good part of you is talking, you definitely want him to be better than you are, but you want him to be the best he could be if your vision is unclouded. Okay, but then you offer him a goal. It's like, well, do this. Well, can he do it? Well, if he can do it without a second's thought, there's no challenge in it. There's no developmental impetus. It's not in the zone of proximal development. You want a goal that you can do, but that requires some improvement on your part. Because you want to attain the goal, that's satisfying, but then you want to make yourself into the thing that can attain goals. And so you want to push yourself. You want to push yourself a bit further. Yes. And there's an ample psychological literature that suggests that that's where maximal motivation is to be found.
Interesting.
So you're pursuing a goal, but you're also pursuing the goal of transforming yourself at the same time. You're doing both of those at the same time.
Do you need to know that you're transforming yourself in order to attain the goal? Or do most people just think, I got to take these steps to make it happen, but they don't realize they're becoming better human beings?
It depends on what you mean by realized. They have the sense of satisfaction and confidence that would indicate that, although they might not be able to make what that means explicit. But I would say it would be better to make it explicit. It adds one other dimension of possible motivation. I still believe that, genuine accomplishment, but it's ethical, it's always ethical accomplishment. I believe that to be the case. Genuine ethical accomplishment is the best source of security, but it's not unerring.
When you mean ethical accomplishment, do you mean
doing something good, right?
Whether people know about it or not, just good and right for yourself? Is that what I'm hearing you say? Or does someone else need to acknowledge that this was good and right?
I think if you've done it for yourself, that's good. But if you do it and other people are in on it and along for the ride, that's also good. And sometimes that's better to bring people along. If it's just a matter of them acknowledging it, well, there's value in that too. I mean, people say, well, you shouldn't care what people think of you. It's like, well, yeah, of course you should. Psychopaths don't care what people think of them. Now, you shouldn't care so much what people think about you that you're willing to lie to maintain whatever it is that you think they value. Like, there are places beyond which that becomes counterproductive, clearly.
The internal problem is, how do you deal with tragedy and malevolence? And you can say, well, I'm not prepared. It's like, yeah, fair enough. Unsurprising, especially if you were overprotected as a child. It's not a good idea to overprotect your kids, because the snakes are going to come into the garden no matter what you do. And so then you, instead of trying to keep the damn snakes away, what you do is you arm your child with something that can help them chop them into pieces and make the world out of them. So that the trick for human thriving in the face of suffering and malevolence is strength, not protection. It's a completely different idea. We also know this clinically. We know, for example, that if you treat people with exposure therapy for agoraphobia, which is, roughly speaking, the fear of chaos, I would say, the fear of everything, you don't make them less afraid. You make them braver. It's not the same thing. Because with an agoraphobic, see, what happens to them is the fall. They never conceptualize death and suffering. They're naive, right? It never enters the theater of their imagination, and it's because they're protected from it. But then something happens. This often happens to women in their 40s, because they're the people most likely to develop agoraphobia. Something happens. They've been protected from chaos by authority their entire life. So maybe they had an overprotective father, and then they went to an overprotective boyfriend, and then they went to an overprotective husband. And maybe they were willing to be subjugated to all three of those because of the protection, right? So that's the bargain. They stay weak and dependent, and maybe they have to, because that's the only way they can appeal to the person who's hyperprotective. But the price they pay for that is that they're not sufficiently competent. And then something happens in their life, often in their 40s. They develop heart palpitations, maybe as a consequence of menopause. Their heart starts to beat erratically, and they think, oh no, death. It's like, well, who are you going to talk to about that? Right? There's no protection from authority for that. Or maybe their friend gets divorced, or maybe their sister dies, or something like that. It brings up the specter of mortality, and maybe the specter of malevolence and mortality, and it brings it up in a way that authority, recourse to authority, cannot solve. And so then they have panic attacks. What happens? They go out, they get afraid, they feel their heart beating, then they get afraid of their heart beating because they think, oh no, I'm going to die, and they think, oh no, I'm going to die, and I'm going to make a fool of myself while I'm doing it and attract a lot of attention. So the two big fears come up. Mortality and social judgment. And then they have a panic attack. It's like fight or flight's gone out of control. Very, very unpleasant. Then they start to avoid the places they've had a panic attack. Then they end up not being able to go anywhere. So then Tiamat has come back, right? A huge monster, a little victim. And so what do you do with them? Well, there's no saying, no, there's no Tiamat. That's done, right? Their naivety is over. They've had a direct contact with the threat of mortality and social judgment. They've met the terrible mother, and they've met the terrible father. And there's no going back. There's no saying, oh, the world is safe. It's not safe. Not at all. It's not safe. The fact that you think it's safe means that you were living in an unconscious bubble that was sort of provided to you by your culture. It's a gift. And now that's been shattered. And so now what do? Well, the answer is you retreat until you're in your house and there's nowhere you can go. You're the ultimate frozen rabbit, right? And your life is hell because you can't function. The alternative is, let's take apart the things you're afraid of. Let's expose you to them, carefully and programmatically. And then you'll learn that you're actually tougher than you think. You never knew that. And maybe you didn't want to take on the responsibility because, people play a role in their own demise, so to speak. When you had opportunity to go out and explore or withdraw because you were afraid, you chose to withdraw because you were afraid. So it's not only that you were overprotected often, it's that you were willing to take advantage of the fact that you were overprotected and run back there whenever you had the opportunity. So maybe you're a kid in the playground, right, and you're having some trouble with other kids, and in the back of your mind, I should deal with this myself, but you go and tell your mom and get her to intervene. And you know that that's not right. You know that you're breaking the social contract, but it's easier, and so that's what you do. You run off to an authority figure and hide behind the Great Father, roughly speaking. Well, the problem with that is you don't learn how to do it yourself. So then you have to relearn it painfully when you're 40. So then you take people out. You say, well, what are you afraid of? Rank it from 1 to 10. So 10 is, we'll make a list of 10 things you're afraid of. The thing you're least afraid of, we'll call number 10. So we'll start with that. Okay, well, I'm afraid of elevators. Okay, well, let's look at a picture of an elevator. Let's have you imagine being in an elevator. Let's go out to an elevator and let you watch the terrible jaws of death open, because that's how you're responding to it symbolically, right? And you're going to do that at the closest proximity you can manage. You find out, you go do that, it works. You're nervous as hell, especially from an anticipatory perspective. Shaking. You go out, you stop, you watch it happen, and you actually calm down. You do that 10 times and it no longer bothers you. Well, what you've learned that you didn't die, but more importantly than that, you've learned that you could withstand the threat of death. That's what you've learned. And then you move a little closer, and then you move a little closer, and then you move a little closer, and finally you're back in what's no longer the elevator from a symbolic perspective. It's a tomb, right? It's a place of enclosure and isolation. And you learn, turns out I can withstand that. And then you're much more together, much more confident. And that's often one of the things that often happens in situations like that. I've seen this multiple times, is that if you run someone through an exposure training process like that and toughen them up, they'll often start standing up to people around them in a way they never did before, because they wouldn't stand up for themselves before because they weren't willing to undermine the protection. See, if you're protecting me, I can't bother you because I can't afford to forsake your protection. So if I'm going to play that game, I'm going to hide behind you, then I can't challenge you. So that's no good, because that's sometimes why people, you see this with guys very frequently, they're still deathly afraid of their father's judgment when they're in their 30s or 40s. It's like, well, why? No, because they still want to believe that there's someone out there that knows. And so they're willing to accept the subjugation because it doesn't force them to challenge the idea that there's someone out there that knows. Because that's the advantage of having your father as a judge, right? Because he knows. Well, what if he doesn't? What if no one knows any better than you? Well, that's a rough thing. You don't, until you realize that, you're not an adult, right? That's really technically the point of realization of adulthood, is that no one actually knows what you should do more than you do. I mean, it's a horrible realization, because what the hell do you know? It's a terrible realization, and people will often pick slavery, permanent slavery, to the spirit of the Great Father, let's say, over that realization, and it's completely understandable. But the problem with it is that there's more to you than you think, and so if you continue to hide behind that figure, then you never have a chance to understand that there's more to you than you think, far more to you than you think. Maybe there's enough to you so that you can actually withstand the threat of mortality without collapsing. Maybe even withstand the threat of malevolence without collapsing. Who knows? It's certainly possible. And it's not an abstract question. It's exactly the sort of question that you address in the psychotherapeutic process. It's always the question that you address. And the answer is often in the affirmative, because people can get unbelievably tough. And you know that because people work in emergency wards in hospitals, right? Or they work in palliative care wards, or they work as mortuary assistants. I mean, these people have bloody rough jobs, or they're on the front line of police investigation into, heinous child abuse
crimes, and so they're confronting malevolence on a regular basis. And you know, those are very stressful jobs, but people do them. And some people do them without even being damaged by them, although that's a harder thing because you can see horrible things, you know, things you'll never forget. If you ask a disagreeable person what he wants, say, or she wants, they'll tell you right away. They know. It's like, this is what I want and this is how I'm going to get it. But agreeable people, especially if they're really agreeable, are so agreeable that they often don't even know what they want, because they're so accustomed to living for other people and to finding out what other people want and to trying to make them comfortable and so forth, that it's harder for them to find a sense of their own desires as they move through life. And that's not, look, there's situations where that's advantageous, but it's certainly not advantageous if you're going to try to forge yourself a career. That just doesn't work at all. And so even though on average men and women aren't that much different in terms of their levels of agreeableness by the group, if you go out and you look at the extremes, they're very different. So all of the most agreeable people are women, and all of the most disagreeable people are men. And the thing is, the extremes are often what matter rather than what's in the middle. And so one of the ways that's reflected in society, by the way, is there's way more men in prison. And the best personality predictor of being imprisoned is to be low in agreeableness. It makes you callous. Now you may think, well, what's the opposite of compassion and politeness? And the answer to that is, I think it's best sort of conceptualized as a trading game. So let's say that we're going to play repeated trading games. And if you're very agreeable, then you're going to bargain harder on my behalf than you're going to bargain on your own behalf. Whereas if you're very disagreeable, you're going to do the reverse. You're going to think, I'm in this trading game for me, and you're going to take care of your own interests. Where an agreeable person is going to say, no, at best, this is, at worst, this has to be 50-50, but I'd like to help you every way I can. One of the things you have to be careful of if you're agreeable is not to be exploited, because you'll line up to be exploited. And I think the reason for that is because you're wired to be exploited by infants. And so that just doesn't work so well in that actual world. And one of the things that happens very often in psychotherapy, you know, people come to psychotherapy for multiple reasons, but one of them is they often come because they're too agreeable. And so what they get is so-called assertiveness training, although it's not exactly assertiveness that's being trained. What it is the ability to learn how to negotiate on your own behalf. And one of the things I tell agreeable people, especially if they're conscientious, is say what you think. Tell the truth about what you think. There's going to be things you think that you think are nasty and harsh. And they probably are nasty and harsh, but they're also probably true. And you need to bring those up to the forefront and deliver the message. And it's not straightforward at all, because agreeable people do not like conflict. Not at all. They smooth the water, you know, and you can see why that is in accordance with the hypothesis that I've been putting forward. You don't want conflict around infants. It's too damn dangerous. You don't want fights to break out. You don't want anything to disturb the relative peace. You know, and if you're also more prone to being hurt physically and perhaps emotionally, you're also maybe loath to engage in the kind of high-intensity conflict that will solve problems in the short term, because it takes a lot of conflict to solve problems in the short term. And, you know, if that can spiral up to where it's dangerous, which it can if it gets uncontrolled, it might be safer in the short term to keep the waters smooth and to not delve into those situations where conflict emerges. The problem with that is it's not a very good medium to long-term strategy, right? Because lots of times there are things you have to talk about because they're not going to go away. And the advantage to having a well-socialized disagreeable person is that they really don't let much get in their way. So if you can get a kid who's disagreeable socialized, that person can be quite the creature, you know, because they're very forward-moving in their nature and very difficult to stop. But if you don't get them successfully domesticated, tamed, roughly speaking, by the time they're 4, their peers reject them. And that's a big problem, because your job as a parent is to make your child socially desirable by the age of 4. Like you want to burn that into your brain, because people don't know that. That's your job. And here's why. It's easy if you think about it carefully. So you imagine you've got a 3-year-old child, so sort of halfway through that initial period of socialization, and you take that child out in public. Okay, what do you want for the child? Who cares about you? What do you want for the child?
You want the child to be able to interact with other children and adults so that the children are welcoming and smile and want to play with him or her, and so the adults are happy to see the child and treat him or her properly. And if your child's a horrible little monster because you're afraid of disciplining them or you don't know how to do that properly, then what they're going to do is they're going to experience nothing but rejection from other children and false smiles from other parents and adults. And so then you're throwing the child out there into a world where every single face that they see is either hostile or lying. And that's not something that's going to be particularly conducive to the mental health or the well-being of your child. If your child can learn a couple simple rules of behavior, like don't interrupt adults when they're talking too much and pay attention and try not to hit the other kids over the head with the truck any more than is absolutely necessary, then, and share and play properly, then when they meet other kids, the kids are going to try out a few little play routines on them, and that's going to go well, and then they're going to go off and socialize each other for the rest of their lives. Because that's what happens, is that from 4 years old onwards, the primary socialization with children takes place among other children. And so if the kids don't get in on that early, they don't move into that developmental spiral upwards and they're left behind. And you can imagine how terrible that is, because a 4-year-old will not play with another 4-year-old who's 2. But a 5-year-old certainly will not play with a 5-year-old who's 2, right? Because the gap is just starting to get unbelievably large. And so the kids start out behind, and then the peers leave them behind, and then those kids are alienated and outside the peer group for the rest of their life. Well, those are the ones that grow up to be long-term antisocial, right? They're already aggressive. It doesn't dip down. Now, what happens to normal boys, roughly speaking? Imagine the aggressive 2-year-old types. They get socialized, so their level of aggression goes down, and then they hit puberty and testosterone kicks in, and bang, levels of aggression go back up. And so that's why males are criminals between the ages roughly of 16 and about 25. So, and it matches the creativity curve, by the way. It's so cool. If you look at the spike of creativity among men, 16 to 25, and it starts to go down, criminality matches that absolutely perfectly. So that's quite cool. So, and so the testosterone levels raise the average level of aggression among men. It's more dominance than aggression, actually, and testosterone is by no means all bad. And then it starts to decrease at about age 25 or 26, which is usually when men stop staying up late at night, stop drinking as much, develop a full-time career, and take on the burdens and responsibilities and opportunities that are associated with a long-term partner and family. And so, well, so that's the development of what I would call predatory aggression, because I also think that the agreeableness distribution is probably something like predatory aggression versus maternal sympathy. It's something like that. So if you look at other mammals that are predators, because we're predators as well as prey animals, if you look at other animals like bears, the male bear has absolutely nothing to do with the raising of the infants. In fact, the female bears will keep the male the hell away because he's likely to kill the infants and maybe even to eat them. So there's no maternality at all in solitary male mammalian predators. It's really useful to investigate the viewpoints of people who have opposing views to yours, because they'll tell you things. Not only will they tell you things you don't know, they'll also tell you how to see the world in ways that you don't see it. And they'll also have skills that you don't have, that you could develop. So for example, if you're an introverted person, it's very useful to watch an extroverted person, because the extroverted person has ways of being in the social world that aren't natural to you, that you can use to improve your toolkit. And if you're disagreeable, one of the best things to do with disagreeable people, especially if that's alienating them from other people, for example, because it can, people treat you like you're a selfish, arrogant son of a, maybe that's because you are. It's like, okay, so what do you do about that? One of the most promising treatments, let's say, for that is get the person to do something for someone else once a day, just as a practice, and learn how to do it. Maybe you can wake the circuit up, if you think that it's lying dormant in you, which is probably right. I think we have a very wide range of propensities within us. Some are switched on, genetic propensities. Some are switched on, but I think that if you put yourself in the right situation or walk yourself through the right exercises, you can switch some of these other things on as well. But it takes work and dedication and discipline. I would say, generally speaking, if you want to adapt yourself properly to life, you should find a niche in the environment that corresponds with your temperament. Right? You shouldn't work at cross purposes to your temperament because it's just too damn difficult. But having done that,
then you should work on developing the skills and viewpoints that exist in the space opposite to your personality, because that's where you're fundamentally underdeveloped. And that way I think you can extend out your temperamental capability across a wider range. And to me, that's roughly equivalent as bringing a richer toolkit to each situation. You know, so if you're hyper extroverted, you should probably learn to shut up at parties now and then and listen just to see what's going on, to see if you can manage it, you know. And if you're introverted, well, then you should learn how to speak in public and to learn how to go to parties without hiding in the corner and saying nothing to anyone. You know, and if you're agreeable, then you need to learn how to be disagreeable so people can't push you around. And if you're disagreeable, you need to learn how to be agreeable so that you're not an evil son of a bitch. So, and the same thing applies even in the conscientious domain. It's like if you're too conscientious, you need to learn to relax and let go a little bit. And if you're unconscientious, it's time, like, get out the Google Calendar, man, and start scheduling your day, right? And beat yourself on the back of the head with a stick until you're disciplined enough so that you can actually stick to something for some length of time and not living in absolute squalor, which is something that would characterize someone who's very disorderly, for example, because they don't notice. It doesn't bother them, disorder. It's like, maybe they can see it, but it doesn't have any emotional valence, and so it doesn't have any motivational significance. You know, so the other thing you might want to think about too, if you're choosing a partner, is try not to choose someone who's too distant from you on the temperamental variables, because you're going to have a hard time bridging the gap. You know, it's hard for an introverted person and an extroverted person to coexist. And it's really hard for an orderly person and a disorderly person to coexist, because they will drive each other nuts. Why don't you pick up? Why are you so obsessed by it? That's the basic argument, you know. So it's useful to know about your temperament so that you can negotiate the space with your partner as well. And I don't think you should try to find someone who's exactly the same as you, because then you don't have the benefits of the alternative viewpoint. But you got to watch it, because you may hit irreconcilable differences of various sorts. And I've seen that most particularly among couples who are high and low in openness. That's a rough one. And also high and low in conscientiousness. That's another rough one, because they just cannot see how the other person sees the world at all. So imagine you have a goal in mind. You want to get to work in the morning. I used to ask my students a question like this, is like, what? Maybe they're going to write an essay. Why are you writing the essay? Why are you in class? Well, I'm in class because I need this class because it's part of my major. Well, why did you pick a major like that? Well, I'm interested in psychology. Well, why did you come to get a degree? Well, I think I need a degree to get a job. Well, why do you need a job? Well, I need a job to keep body and soul together, and maybe to be productive, and maybe to, you know, establish a name for myself. And why do you want to do that? Well, because, you know, it's part and parcel of living properly. And why do you want to live properly? And well, then, and how would you live if you lived properly? And at that point, people are usually unable to answer, you know, because you can just push people with questions about why until they run out of explanations. But the point is that you're always doing whatever you're doing because what you're doing is nested in a sequence of goal-directed actions. And those can be more or less sophisticated. If you're not very sophisticated at all, the nesting might be like 2 structures deep. You know, maybe you're, I don't know, you're bored and you want to go get drunk, you know, and why? Well, because you don't want to be bored. And if someone pushes you a little farther than that, you hit them. And, you know, you don't want to delve into it. But if you're sophisticated, you have a pretty good hierarchy of answers. So you might say, well, why do you want to be a productive and generous citizen? And like I said, people usually bottom out there, but you could say, well, that's part of reciprocal altruism, and if I'm productive and generous, then that'll encourage other people to be productive and generous, and if we're all productive and generous together, then there'll be more for everyone, and we'll all get along better, and we'll get along for a longer period of time, and that'll make us all more stable, and that'll make our societies better, and then you might say, well, why is that relevant? You might say, well, because the alternative to that is something like a descent into something approximating hell, and so that's part of a reflection of the divine order and the eternal battle between good and evil. And then you could push it farther than that, and you could say, well, are you going to be on the side of the redemptive hero, or are you going to be on the side of the eternal adversary? Like, you can keep digging down farther and farther, and the farther down you dig, the more you get down into what you might describe as the implicit religious substrate. And it's very much useful to know that and to make as much of that conscious as possible. So now imagine that you've come to this talk tonight because you've decided to aim up. And maybe you haven't formulated that precisely explicitly, but something is driving you in this direction. And then you come to the talk and you find out that I'm talking about something that isn't what you expected, and it doesn't seem to be moving you along on your pathway forward to that end. And what's going to happen is you're going to be disappointed. And you might be anxious too. You're going to be disappointed because disappointment signals that you're experiencing something that's not relevant to the goal that you are attempting to pursue, and that might in fact be interfering with it. That's what negative emotion does. And maybe if you're disappointed in what I say, that also makes you anxious because you assumed that you would come here and I would say something relevant, because you assumed that you knew who I was, and then it turned out that I didn't, and then you don't know who I am, and then you don't know what you're doing here, and then you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because that's what anxiety is for. It tells you when the pathway to your goal has been disrupted, so multiple pathways have now emerged. So imagine you're driving your car to work and it quits. And what happens is you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because, well, you were beetling along quite nicely in your world, and everything was reduced to like a unidimensional simplicity. You weren't in a car as an object, you were in a thing that took you to where you wanted to go, and it was just doing what it was supposed to be doing, tracking you along the pathway to your goal. And then it fails and you're off on the side of the road, and you get anxious because how the hell are you going to get to work? And what if you don't get to work? And is your boss not going to be very happy with you? And maybe this is the third mistake you've made this week. And what if you get fired? And weren't you an idiot for buying this car? And maybe you shouldn't have a car at all. Maybe you should have walked to work. And maybe you should take a bicycle, because after all, that would save the planet. And and maybe now you have to take your car to a mechanic, but the last time you went to the mechanic, you got ripped off because you're too stupid about vehicles to manage one, and you're kind of stupid about technology in general. And aren't you stupid? And maybe you're too stupid, and isn't your wife going to? That's anxiety, right? And that's the emergence of a multiplicity of pathways, right? And so what anxiety signifies is the degeneration of an attentional hierarchy into multiplicity. And the reason you get anxious and it feels bad is because now your body can't compute how much energy you have to put out in order to get to your goal. And so you can't organize the world. You're apt to use more resources than you'll replenish. And if you continue to do that, then you'll die. And so anxiety is a signal that complexity has reemerged, chaos. That's the eternal dragon of chaos. Chaos has reemerged because your narrative has collapsed. And so that's negative emotion. That's what negative emotion signifies, is that it's the collapse of an organizing narrative. And so that's very interesting to know. So you feel positive. If I walk on the stage and I know I'm supposed to go to the front of the stage, say, and the reason I want to do that is because I know I have to talk to you, and and I want to talk to you because I think it's valuable to talk to you, etc. That's nested in a hierarchy of value. And if I see a clear pathway to the front of the stage, then that actually produces positive emotion. And that positive emotion impels me forward, because positive emotion does impel you forward. That's what it's for. That's how positive emotion is linked to action. So if you're enthusiastic because you can see a pathway forward to a valued goal, and that enthusiasm manifests itself. This is true even neurochemically. It manifests itself as positive motivation to move forward. And not only that, if you're moving forward and it's working, your brain tracks the fact that it's working, and then That's linked to dopamine release, by the way, which is what cocaine releases. It's linked to dopamine release, and the other thing your brain is doing, even when you're just walking to where you want to go, if you're successfully walking there, your brain tracks what you're doing. There's circuits that are activated while you're doing it, and if what you're doing results in the result you desired, then the dopamine floods those little neurons that are active, and it makes them grow and flourish. And so as you practice something that's working, the circuit that is activated as you're practicing is bathed in dopamine, and that makes it stronger. And that feels good. It's growth. It's part of positive emotion. And so the positive emotion moves you forward, but also encourages you to develop a habit of that practice. And so one of the things I would bloody well say is, don't make a habit of pursuing things that aren't good for you, because you build that into you. That's what happens if you become addicted to something, you know. You build a little monster inside you that's grown, it's there, it's after one goal, despite everything else. Not a good outcome. So now positive emotion also signals the fact that it's also an energy conservation observation. So as I move forward towards my goal, with each step I take, it's going to take less energy to get to the goal. And so that means that the positive emotion signifies, what would you say? It signifies the increasing efficiency of your action as you move towards a goal. So negative emotion signifies the fact that things have got too complex for you to manage, and positive emotion signifies that you're approaching your goal and becoming, and that there's less demand on energy output with every step forward. And so that's emotion. And that's pretty much worth knowing. And then what happens when you're watching a movie is you infer the goal of the protagonist, or the villain for that matter. You infer the goal of the character that's being portrayed on the screen. You adopt that goal as your own. Then you play out the emotions in your own body, which mimics the structure what would you call the character that's being portrayed on the screen, and you live that all out inside you. And that's also how you understand other people, right? You don't listen to someone and then figure out what they're saying and then infer what they're thinking. That isn't how it works. What you do is you listen to someone till you figure out what they're up to. As soon as you figure out what they're up to, you can adopt that frame of reference. As soon as you adopt that frame of reference, you have the same emotions. And that's what makes you united. And so that's so interesting. And so then you think, look, there's 5,000 people in here. If there were 5,000 chimpanzees, you guys would be tearing each other into shreds, because no one would be able to know what anyone else was up to. But because all of you are here paying attention to the same thing in the same way, you have virtually identical emotional states, and that means instantly your behavior is rendered predictable to one another. And there's no difference between that and peace. They're the same thing. And so what that means is that one of the predicates of a civil, productive, and peaceful society is that everyone inhabits the same narrative. And you might say, well, we don't need the same narrative. It's like, yes, we do, because if we inhabit a different narrative, then we're running emotionally in different directions, and we will not understand each other, and we will run into conflict, and that conflict can become deadly at the drop of a hat. And so it's a precondition for a civil society that everyone is united in the same narrative. And then that begs the question, right? What is the narrative insofar as we're unified? And another question, which is, what should the narrative be? Right? Now, the postmodernists figured out that we looked at the world through a story, but they said their mantra is they became skeptical of meta-narratives, which are uniting narratives. And that's all well and good to be skeptical about meta-narratives, but you run into the problem of internal disunion. Because if you don't have a uniting narrative, then you're divided against yourself, and you run into the problem of social disunity, because if we're not looking at the same thing for the same reason, then we can't get along. And those are big problems. Now, the way the postmodernists glided over that immense cataclysmic problem was to offer the proposition that the narrative that unites us is just one of power and oppression, right? And that the fundamental motivation that guides, first of all, even your internal organization, your own internal tyranny, you know, you're oppressing your id or your natural self. And then if you establish a relationship with someone like a marriage, well, that's just a manifestation of patriarchal oppression. And if you organize a business relationship, it's a relationship of mutual exploitation, and so far and so on, all the way up the political hierarchy, all the way back into the past. A more dismal view of human existence couldn't possibly be formulated. And I always think about it as a kind of implicit confession. It's like, so you think the world's all run by power, do you? Okay, I know what game you're playing and attempting to justify, and it's completely bloody preposterous because, first of all, if you tyrannize yourself, you're going to be one miserable creature. Plus, you're going to rebel constantly, as you already know. I'm sure all of you have tried at one time or another in your life to force yourself to do something with a whip, so to speak, and what you instantly find is that you're so condemned to be free that you'll even resist your own tyranny, right? Try telling yourself to do something and see if you do it. I'm going to go to the gym. That's New Year's. I'm going to the gym 3 times a week, 2 hours a day. It's like, no, you're not. You're going to last like 3 days. And then you're going to find an excuse. The rebellious part of you is going to find an excuse, then you're not going to do it. And it's a bloody mystery, isn't it? Because you'd think you could tell yourself what to do. Because otherwise, who are you, you know? You're the part that told yourself what to do, but you don't listen, so what the hell's that part? That's you, that's for sure. So you can't even tyrannize yourself with any efficiency. And then if you're married, men, you're married, try tyrannizing your wife and see how well that works. And like, it might work for 10 minutes, but she's not as big as you, but she's a lot sneakier. And you have to wake up with her tomorrow morning. And so even if you do win the fight, which you won't, she's going to bloody well take it out on you the next day, and no wonder. And so you're bound in that relationship by the necessity of continual iterative interactions, right? And they have to be moderately peaceful, or you're going to tear each other into shreds. And if it's constant conflict, you're both going to just exhaust yourself and die. So how the hell is that going to work? So it has to be at least mutually reinforcing. And maybe if you really got it together well, you could interact with each other in a way that improved your interactions across time. And maybe you're wise enough so that if you were on that track, the way you would experience that in the moment would be as exactly the kind of relationship you'd want to have with someone. And that would be something like the spirit of play and romantic love. And that would be the manifestation of an instinct that orients you across time properly in a relationship in the moment. And that's such a wonderful thing to know, right? That instinct for play and romantic love might be the voice of the wisest instinct you have, the deepest orientation to meaning that you have. You know, because there's nothing more delightful in a marriage or in a family, if you have children, than to be able to engage in something like voluntary play. And you know, if you could have the world set up the way you would want it to, if you had any sense, wouldn't it be something if mostly what you did was something akin to play? And that's equivalent. Christ in the gospel says, know that unless you become like a little child, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And what does that mean? It means to rediscover that intense immersion in life and that capacity for play that characterized us all as children, that we can't maintain because we have to mature, but that we could rediscover as adults if we were sufficiently wise and careful. And so, and then, you know, if you have friends, it's like, well, you tyrannize your friends? Well, then you don't have friends. You're just a bully with henchmen. And as soon as you stumble, they're going to stab you in the back because you surrounded yourself with craven psychopaths. They're just going to wait for the moment to take you out. That's not a friendship, obviously. And if you're running a business, and those of you who've run businesses who have a clue know this is true, it's like, what happens if you rip off your customers? Well, you can get away with it once or twice, but word gets around in no time flat. And then you're just done and bitter and resentful because your idiot machinations conversations didn't work. But if you engage in fair trade and you're reliable and you deliver what you promised and you're half decently good to your employees and the people that you work for, then they're going to be pleased with you, and they're going to come back and they're going to talk to their friends about how well you did, and you're going to flourish. And none of that's arbitrary. You know, that's all guided by the manifestation of a certain form of attentional priority, right? You go to your customer's house, maybe you're a plumber, and the first thing you do is you listen to their damn problem. And so at least you have enough sense to engage in dialogos, right? You actually want to hear what the problem is, and then you actually want to solve it. And if you do that with some diligence, they're going to be pleased with you because they don't want sewage all over the rug. And so your interests are aligned, and if you offer what you promise, then you're going to evoke positive emotion in them and quell their anxiety, and that's exactly the service that you're offering. And so that means you're acting out the proper story, you're productive and generous and honest, and there's nothing arbitrary about that as a ethos that unites you internally and that also makes it possible for you to exist in a peaceful and productive society.
Faith is a presupposition for living in the truth. And then you might ask yourself another question, which is, well, why bother living in the truth? Well, one answer would be so that reality doesn't rise up and smite you repeatedly, which it will if you're deceptive. So that's one answer, but here's another answer, and this is a better answer. People ask themselves all the time, what's the purpose of life? And there's a variety of answers to that. There's no purpose. We're just atoms on a dust mote at the edge of a rather reprehensible corner of the cosmos, and we exist for a moment and we're out, and that's that. Or we're so lost in a plethora of subordinate meanings that we're confused and aimless. Or we want to be hedonistically happy, and I would say that's really the offer that's on the table in our culture most of the time. It's like, well, I just want to be happy. And people will say that to you. It's a slogan. It's the most common slogan of our time, I would say. And it's such a preposterous slogan. It's like, what do you mean just? You just want to be happy. That's all. That's all you want. That absolute impossibility. You want bliss unending, no matter what you do. And that's all you want. It's not exactly a small ask, let's say, because it's the same thing as asking to dwell permanently in paradise. It's something like that. So it's not that likely. And then it also isn't true. That isn't what you want. If you do careful analysis of what people mean when they say they just want to be happy, what they mean is they don't want to suffer stupidly. We're much more concerned with not experiencing an excess of negative emotion than we are with experiencing a surfeit of positive pleasure. So first of all, we don't mean we just want to be happy. We mean, please don't make us too miserable. And fair enough, that's reasonable. But then even on the happiness front, even on the absence of misery front, that's not true. One of the things Dostoevsky pointed out in Notes from Underground, which is so bloody brilliant, he was criticizing the idea of materialist utopia. He said something like, well, imagine we made our materialist utopian dreams come true and everybody had enough to eat all the cakes they wanted and enough to drink and nothing to do, he said, but busy themselves with the continuation of the species. And we were so pleased that we emitted nothing but bubbles of bliss. He said, human beings were so damn ungrateful that the first thing we do is take a stick and smash up all that comfortable prosperity just so that something unexpected and provocative could happen. And that's very smart. You know, that's hearkening in some sense back to the story of the Garden of Eden and the proclivity of human beings to eat the forbidden fruit. It's like it isn't obvious at all that we want happiness. It isn't even obvious that we want absence of misery. What's really obvious is that we want an adventure. right? We want an adventure that's so compelling that it makes the misery of life not just justifiable, but worthwhile. You want to look back on your life, you know. You want to look back on your life, and you know this to be true. You want to be able to say to yourself, even considering a month or a week or a series of days, you want to be able to say, that was really difficult, but you know what? It was worth it. And I think that's what you want from your life. It's something like, you know what? That was difficult, but it was worth it. And that meant that the adventure was so great that it justified the difficulties. And so then the question is, and here's the question, where do you find the great adventure of your life? Well, how about in truth? Well, why? Because you don't know what's going to happen if you tell the truth. It's a mystery. It's going to lay itself out for you. And so that's an adventure, because you literally do not know what's going to happen. You have to let go of knowing what's going to happen. And so then you have that adventure, and then what is also the case is that it's you that's having the adventure, right? Because if what you're doing is living in truth, that's you, that truth is you. And so that means that whatever happens when you tell the truth is your adventure. And then you think, well, I'm using deception. It's like, well, maybe you are, but maybe deception is using you. And then maybe it's the spirit of deception that's having the adventure of your life. And then you might ask yourself, well, why are you so miserable and unhappy? And the answer would be, well, the spirit of deception is having the adventure of your life. You're not even there. Because if you're not living in truth, you're not there, obviously. What's there is the spirit of deception. And you might think that's your deception, but I would be very careful about thinking that, because there have been centuries of meditation on the nature of the spirit of deception. And the answer isn't that the spirit of deception is you. The answer is that the spirit of deception is something that possesses you and convinces you that it's you. And that's not something you want to fall into the clutches of. So now you have to tell me the question again.
I'm certain you answered it. This was about teenagers.
Oh, yes. Well, back to the teenagers. Do you not want to go to college, or are you just lying about being lazy? So that's a question, and we can ask ourselves that question. And as I said, on the teenage front, craft a vision, craft a compelling vision. That's really what we are as human beings, is we're visionaries. That's how we confront the horizon of the future. We meet the horizon of the future by crafting a compelling vision. And your vision might not involve a college education, but it should be a vision that makes you think, if I could make that come true, it would justify the trouble that it would take to manage it. And I think that's the right attitude to take towards your life. And we're all going to have our crosses to bear in the most fundamental manner. We all have to deal with the catastrophe of mortality. And I think we all have to deal with the reality of hell. And you can think about that religiously or not. Political hell will do for hell as far as I'm concerned. We certainly saw no shortage of evidence for that in the 20th century. And we all have to contend with that, right? The reality of mortality and the reality of hell. And then we all have to contend with the fact that we have to develop a vision for our life that is so compelling that it justifies those bitter realities. And that's really the nature of the religious enterprise. And that's something you can embark on and should embark on young. If you're trying to figure out who you are, it's figure out who you need to be in order to justify the catastrophe of your life. And then you think, well, that was difficult. Man, that's for sure. But it was worth it. So, thank you very much. It was very good of all you to come tonight. I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you, Tim.
You're welcome.
Yep. Lovely to be here.
That's so nice.
Thank you. Thank you all. Yep. Good night.
So, you know, one way of conceptualizing yourself is that you're one speck of dust among 7 billion. And when you conceptualize yourself that way, you might think, well, what difference does it make what I say or do? And that's actually quite convenient for you, because if it doesn't matter what you say or do, then you don't have any responsibility and you can do whatever you want. The price you pay for that is a bit of nihilism, but if you don't have to shoulder any responsibility, that's a small price to pay. That's the underground motivation for nihilism. But the other way of looking at it, and this is actually the accurate way of looking at it, is that you're in a network. You're a node in a network. And so you can do a little bit of arithmetic very rapidly and just figure out how powerful you are. You know 1,000 people. You're going to know more than that over the course of your life, but let's say 1,000 for the sake of argument for now. They know 1,000 people. That means that you're one person away from 1 million people and 2 persons away from 1 billion people. And you're the center of that network. And now the way networks work is that information propagates in a networked manner. So don't underestimate the power of your speech. Now, you know, Western culture is phallogocentric. Let's say it. Okay, so we'll say, yeah, that's just fine. That's exactly what it is. It's predicated on the idea of the logos, that the logos is the sacred element of Western culture. And what does that mean? It means that your capacity for speech is divine. It's the thing that generates order from chaos and then sometimes turns pathological order into chaos when it has to. Don't underestimate the power of truth. There's nothing more powerful. Now, in order to speak what you might regard as the truth, you have to let go of the outcome. You have to think, all right, I'm going to say what I think, stupid as I am, biased as I am, ignorant as I am. I'm going to state what I think as clearly as I can, and I'm going to live with the consequences no matter what they are. Now, the reason you think that, that's an element of faith. The idea is that nothing brings a better world into being than the stated truth. Now, you might have to pay a price for that, but that's fine. You're going to pay a price for every bloody thing you do and everything you don't do. You don't get to choose to not pay a price. You get to choose which poison you're going to take. That's it. So if you're going to stand up for something, stand up for your truth. It'll shape you, because people will respond and object and tell you why you're a fool and a biased moron and why you're ignorant. And then if you listen to them, you'll be just that much less like that the next time you say something. And if you do that for 5 years, you'll be so damn tough and articulate and able to communicate and withstand pressure that you won't even recognize yourself. And then you'll be a force to contend with. And you don't get to wait until, because I get letters like Sad gets all the time too, from faculty members in particular, and they say, well, you know, when I get tenure, it's like, then they think, well, when I'm an associate professor, and then they think, well, when I'm a full professor. It's like, if you're a professor already, you're like the most protected person in the history of the planet, you know, and you need, well, okay, but one of the things that indicates is that it's almost impossible to provide people with enough protection so that they feel safe to speak. Okay, so we'll address that directly. It is not safe to speak, and it never will be. But the thing you got to keep in mind is that it's even less safe not to speak. Right? It's a balance of risks. It's like you want to pay the price for being who you are and stating your mode of being in the world, or do you want to pay the price for being a bloody serf, one that's enslaved him or herself? Well, that's a major price, man. That thing unfolds over decades, and you'll just be a miserable worm at the end of about 20 years of that, right? No self-respect, no power, no ability to voice your opinions, nothing left but resentment because everyone's against you, because of course you've never stood up for yourself. It's like, say what you think carefully, pay attention to your words. The price is, it's a price you want to pay if you are willing to believe that truth is the cornerstone of society. And in the most real sense, if you're willing to take that leap, then tell the truth and see what happens. And nothing better could possibly happen to you
There'll be ups and downs, and there'll be pushback, and there'll be controversy and all of that, but it doesn't matter. The truth is what makes the world, the truth is what redeems the world from hell, and that's the truth. And we saw plenty of hell over the last 100 years, you know, and we haven't learned a bloody thing from it. It's like, wake up, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. That's a start. And you got to understand that's a risk. But I have one more brief thing to say about that. So, you know, I said what I had to say back in September, and I'm sure that I could have done it better, and many people have told me how I could have done it better, although it didn't mean they would actually do it, but and you know, my job was at risk, serious risk, for about 2 months, and it destabilized my family, who've been very brave about this, so like, thumbs up to them, man. They've just stood by me. But here's the optimistic news, is the university has left me alone completely. I shook hands with the dean 2 weeks ago. We're on friendly terms. They don't want this to go any farther than it has already. The students were tremendously welcoming when I came back to teach in January. I haven't had a single negative incident at the university. And I've received thousands of letters from people all over the world, all of which have been in support. I've received 2 negative letters. That's it. 2. So the people have an inchoate longing to have the sort of thing that we're talking about articulated. And so don't be thinking you're alone. It's just that people can't talk, they're afraid to talk, or they don't know what to say. And those are real problems. So if you're reasonably articulate, like, start talking and sharpen yourself up. I mean, the enemy is a cloud. They're a cloud of gnats. They're only courageous in groups. They're only courageous in mobs. If you stand your ground and don't apologize and articulate things properly, they'll disperse around you like they're not even there. So most of it's illusion. So don't be afraid, but be afraid of the right thing. And the right thing you should be afraid of is not saying what you say, because that's the same as not being. And here you are, suffering away. You might as well be at the same time. At least then there's something to you. So. What happens to you as you stroll merrily on your way through life? Well, what happens is that as you're moving from point A to point B, you encounter things. And people think that what they encounter are objects, but that's not the case. First of all, most of the things that you encounter, many of the things are actually other people, and they're not objects. They're too damn complex. And even apart from the social world, the things that you encounter aren't objects. They seem to be something more like tools or obstacles. And I don't mean that we see objects and turn them into tools or obstacles. I mean that we see tools and obstacles, because what happens is that when you array yourself towards a goal, then the world transforms itself into things that get in the way of that goal, and three things. Things that get in the way of the goal, those are things you don't like. Things that facilitate your movement towards the goal, those are things that you like, and irrelevant things. And mostly you want irrelevant things, because there's just too damn many things. So the category of irrelevant is one you really like. So most of everything is irrelevant if you have a good plan. A few things are good because they move you forward, and some other things are not so good. You want to go around the not so good things if you can manage them, unless you like to run head forth into like brick walls, which is not particularly, it's a learning experience, but I wouldn't repeat it too many times. You want the world to array itself as a set of, we could say, tools. Now, what happens is that you have this perceptual system that's mediated by dopamine. It's the same system that cocaine activates, or methamphetamine, or the drugs that people really like to take. And it's the dopaminergic system that responds with positive emotion to indications that you've encountered something that will facilitate your movement towards a goal. And that's really important to know, because people tend to think that they're happy because they achieve goals, and that's not true. What's true, because as soon as you achieve a goal, then you have a problem, which is what's the next goal. And that's actually a big problem. You encounter that as soon as you graduate from university, for example. That's right. I made this joke before. Graduation day, you're like king of the university hierarchy, undergraduate hierarchy. Day after, you're unemployed potential Starbucks employee, right? So it's like, so obviously the accomplishment per se as a source of reward is problematic, because when you accomplish, you run the frame to its end, and then you have the problem of needing a new frame. So that's a problem. But if what you're encountering instead are things that will move you along your way, it's like, hey, that's great, and that's where you get your positive motivation. And so that's really that's so much worth thinking about. You can think about that for a year, and that wouldn't even be enough to think about it, because here's what it means. It means, in some sense, that the Buddhists are right with their claim about Maya, M-A-Y-A, which means that people live in an illusion. And what they mean by that is, well, you have goal, whatever your goal is, and that goal gives relevance to the world. And you can change the relevance of the world in a snap just by changing your goal. You can do that. And so then you think, well, it's sort of an illusion because you can just change it. Now, you don't want to push that line of argumentation too far, because even if the specific point can be changed, the fact that you're in one of these frames cannot be changed. And so you have to be in a frame, although you get to pick the frame. So there's still an absolute there, which is that you have to be in a frame, and that is not a trivial absolute. It's a very major absolute. So then you think, okay, all of your positive emotion is going to be experienced in relationship to the goal. Well, then we think, well, you could use some positive emotion. It's a good thing. Positive emotion inhibits anxiety and disappointment and frustration and pain. It does all that. Technically, it does that. That's why a football player with a broken thumb who wants to score a touchdown can go out there and, play the football game, even though it's a kind of an arbitrary goal, right? It's like, really, you're going to go out there and like risk your hand to fire a pigskin through some poles? It's like, well, you can say the same sort of cynical thing about most of the things that people do, but you can't say the cynical thing about the fact that they have to do things. So you have a point, you have your aim, you have your ambition, and then that's what turns the world into a potentially positive place. And here's the kicker. This is so cool. The higher the aim, the more the positive emotion. So that's you think, well, why should I bother? Why should I bother doing something lofty and difficult? It's like, because it's worth it. That's why. Because the alternative is stupid suffering. Because really, because what happens is, like, you don't need a framework in order to suffer. You can just lay there day after day and suffer, right? That's easy. So that's the default condition. If you don't have a lofty ambition, then you suffer miserably. And the reason for that is life is really complex, short, finite, full of suffering, and beyond you. And so you can just lay there and think about that, and it's horrible. And so that's not helpful. It's just not useful. And so, people often say life is meaningless. It's like, no, it's not. That's wrong. Because if it was meaningless, that'd be easy. You could just sit there and do nothing, and it wouldn't matter, right? It'd be like you were like a lobotomized sheep. It's just irrelevant. But that isn't what happens. When people say that life has no meaning, that isn't what they mean. What they mean is, I'm suffering stupidly and intensely, and I don't know what to do about it. Well, the suffering is meaningful. It's just not the kind of meaning you want. So how do you get out of that? You note the baseline of suffering, which is very, 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 very high. And then you say to yourself, okay, I need to do something that justifies that. And that's not so easy, because the baseline for suffering is high. If you're going to make something of yourself, let's say, so that it's worthwhile to exist in the world, then you have to aim at something that's so well structured that you can say, yeah, earthquakes, cancer, death of my family, dissolution of my goals, ultimate futility of life, and the heat death of the universe. Hey, it doesn't matter, it's worth it.
It's funny that philosopher Kierkegaard, you don't usually hear a joke that starts like that, by the way. He wrote 150 years ago, and he was one of the first people who really wrote about anxiety. He was one of the first psychological philosophers. And he regarded himself as rather useless, all things considered. And he wrote a section in one of his books about all the industrialists that were operating in Europe at that time, trying in every possible way to make life easier and more efficient and productive for everyone, which was definitely happening during the Victorian period and Europe was rapidly transforming into an industrial powerhouse. And he said, someone as useless as him, with an orientation towards being a student who liked to sit and contemplate ideas and talk in cafes and smoke cigars and drink, could never do anything to make anything easier for anyone than everyone was already trying to make it. And so he thought that his task would be to make things more difficult for people, because there would come a time when what people wanted wasn't more ease, but more challenge and more difficulty. And that's really smart, you know, and it's witty and it's true. And one of the things that I've come to understand, I believe, is that, and Dostoevsky knew this too. He wrote about this in Notes from Underground. It's a great book, very short book, brilliant, absolutely brilliant, compelling, dark read. It's the confession of a miserable, resentful, like murderously genocidal bureaucrat who evaluates his own soul, I suppose, and confesses his sins. And it's also a critique of the idea of kind of utopia oriented towards security. And Dostoevsky, who was dealing with the set of ideas that are really tearing us apart culturally right now, this idea of a eventual utopia based on something like security and safety. Dostoevsky really objected to that back in this, like 1860, a long time ago. He said, you know, the thing about people that you don't really understand is that, he said, fundamentally we're ungrateful and we can curse. That's what distinguished us from the animals, which I thought is pretty damn comical. But he said something very interesting, you know. He said, if you set up a utopia so that all people had to do was eat cakes and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, that, yeah, right, Russian humor, you know, that after a surfeit of that, after enough of that, which would happen quite quickly, people would just go mad just to break things, just so something unexpected and remarkable could happen, and that we're not built for security and safety, but for something, well, let's call it adventure, something like adventure. That's a good thing to know, you know, because you don't want to suffer unduly. That seems reasonable. And you might think, because of that, that really what you want is happiness. But then Solzhenitsyn, for example, he wrote about what happened in the Gulag Archipelago under Stalin and said, you know, if your goal is happiness, what are you going to do when the jackboots hammer down your door at 2 a.m. and haul you off to the prison camp, because you're not going to be happy there. And so, you know, happiness is a boat that's easily capsized and the waves are always there. And so if your philosophy is one of, say, impulsive happiness, same sort of thing Dostoevsky was pointing at, and Kierkegaard, then you're not prepared when all hell breaks loose. And all hell, it will absolutely 100% break through at some point in your life. And you're lucky if it won't be decades, you know, it'll certainly be some of it, and it might be a lot of it. And for some of you, it's going to be damn near the whole thing. And so if what floats your boat is happiness, you're going to be capsized by the first decent wave. And so then you might ask yourself, you know, what do you have instead of happiness that might be even more reliable? And I do think that adventure is more reliable than happiness. And in the Old Testament story of Abraham, founder of the Abrahamic faiths, and obviously what would you call it, a crucial figure in the development of world culture, Abraham is presented as a late bloomer, to say the least. He's like 83. People lived longer back then, at least so the story goes. And he had a very rich father by nomadic standards, and he could just sit around in the tent all day, and, you know, a doting mother and a rich father, he could just sit around in the tent all day and eat peeled grapes and busy himself with the continuation of the species. And but, you know, God appears to him and says, get away, get out of your security, get out of your comfort, leave your family, leave your community, leave your nation, go out into the world. And it's a very interesting story. It's very interesting to contemplate it from both a psychological and a religious perspective, because what God is presented as in that book, which is a crucial book for the, as I said, for world culture, is God is presented as the manifestation of the Spirit that calls even the too secure and pampered to adventure. And then Abraham has a pretty rough time when he goes out and has his adventure. It's not all, you know, Skittles and roses from then on in. Quite the contrary. And he runs right away into like a conspiracy of elites to steal his wife. He runs into tyranny, runs into starvation. He encounters war. It's like he goes out in the world and he has the whole tragedy of his life, both on the social and political front and individually, you know. But the promise is the promise of adventure, and the implication is that if you have a sufficient adventure, then that cannot so much protect you from suffering, because perhaps that is impossible, but to justify it. And because you kind of know this in your own life. When you look at your life, you might look back on travails that you've undertaken, you know, and when they've done end-of-life surveys with people and asked them what they regret. And, you know, people don't regret what they did that didn't work. They regret what they didn't do that could have worked. You know, they regret the chances they didn't take. And, you know, even if you do an evaluation of your biography, one of the things that you want to be able to say to yourself is something like, maybe there's nothing better you can say to yourself than this. You can think about this for yourself and see if it's true. That was extraordinarily difficult, but it was worth it. And, you know, it's not like you can have one of those without the other, because you can't imagine that you could have some confidence in what you've managed to accomplish, right? The kind of confidence that would instill you with a certain genuine sense of self-regard despite your fundamental inadequacy. To have that fundamental sense of self-regard that's grounded in something real, it has to be based in a narrative that approximates that was extremely difficult, but it was worth it. You have to have both of those. And so that's interesting, because one of the questions we always ask ourselves, this is the theodicy question, technically. You see the suffering in the world, you see the suffering of children, you see maybe your own children or your suffering, and you wonder, well, how can reality be constituted so that I can have faith in its essence when there is so much suffering? And one answer to that is something like, well, how much suffering do you want? And you might think, none. It's like, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that's right. You want, at least you want something approximating optimized challenge. So you could say, at least you want to be pushed to your limit. And maybe you find the most exciting times in your life. In fact, you'll pay for this. You'll pay to have this experience, to be pushed to your limit. Like, not beyond it, or maybe even a bit beyond it, you know. And maybe not so far beyond it that you crumble and break and things fall apart. But, you know, could you be pushed to your limit optimally if there wasn't the possibility of falling apart and breaking? Like, that's an open question. How are you ever going to take something seriously if the consequences aren't actually serious? You know, and there's something delightful about dancing on the edge. That's why Hawaiians believed that surfing was sacred, you know, and it's because to surf you have to be on the edge, right? And the waves can come and take you out at any moment. But without the possibility of the waves rising to take you out, then you can't dance on the edge. And maybe that's exactly what you want to do, you know. And there's good evidence from the neuroscience literature that consciousness itself is something akin to dancing on the edge. So technically, when you're conscious, when you're awake, your brain is occupying a position between something. It's a position that's something like between chaos and order. And if your brain's maximally ordered, well, you're just bored, nothing is changing. And if you're chaotic, then it's anxiety and catastrophe. But you want to be positioned right between those two, and that's when your consciousness is optimized, you know. And when your consciousness is optimized, then you're deeply engaged in life, and everything seems alive and meaningful. And maybe that's the solution in some profound sense to the problem of suffering. It's that you optimize your interaction with chaos rather than being protected all the time from everything that could hurt you. And you kind of know this too if you have kids, because you don't want to keep your kids in an infantile state, and because when they're infants, pretty much what you do with them, say they're 6 months and younger, is you just keep them secure and safe, right? You just provide everything that you can for them. You have to do that because, well, what are they going to do? They just lay there fundamentally and squawk now and then. I mean, it's not like they're ambulatory. They can't go out and do things for themselves. And so it's up to you. And your goal is to keep them secure and safe. But once they start being able to move around, then increasingly it's sort of up to them. And if you have any sense as a parent, the psychoanalysts used to say, the good mother necessarily fails. And what did they mean by that? They meant, well, you know, if you're committed to your infant when you're a mother for the first 6 months, it's like it's all the kid, 100%, full self-sacrifice devoted towards the infant. That's the right attitude. But even by 9 months, child can crawl around quite a lot. They're developing something of an independent will. You start handing them challenges. You start handing them responsibility, and you keep them on the edge. And some of your kids are going to be able to be pushed harder than others. And part of the reason you have to develop a relationship with your kids, and your husband for that matter, is so that, you know, you can keep them dancing on the edge, on the proper edge. And that's even better than the mere provision of security. Another way of thinking about this too, you know, in the Abrahamic stories, God calls to Abraham to get him to leave his father's tent. He's there like till he's 80, you know, lagging around, lolling around, being useless. And the call to adventure arises, and it's attributed to the voice of God. And Abraham goes out in the world, and he has a hell of a terrible time of it. He encounters famine and tyranny and conspiracy to steal his wife. And like, it's really quite dreadful, to the point where you might think that Abraham was a lot better off just being in his tent. But the story insists that Abraham's adventure is not only necessary, but a precondition for, well, for the entirety of Western civilization that follows in his stead, essentially. And so it's difficult, but necessary. And I think there's an analogy between the voice that calls Abraham as an individual away from his father's tent, you know, the safe confines of his father's tent, and the political voice that calls Moses to pull his entire people out of the tyranny in Egypt. I don't think that's an unreasonable parallelism. And so God in that situation is the voice of adventure and the voice of freedom. Okay, now, Moses heeds this call and convinces the Pharaoh, eventually, to let the Israelites go. And so they leave tyranny. And the story is very interesting to me because it's so sophisticated in structure, because you might think once you get out of the tyranny, problem solved, right? And you could even think about this in terms of the tyranny of your own preconceptions. You drop the constraints you've laid upon yourself, the arbitrary constraints you've laid upon yourself, or you stop imposing your will on other people, or you escape from political or social tyranny, and everything's immediately better. And that's not what happens in the story at all. What happens is that the Israelites go from the tyranny into the desert. And it's not obvious at all that the desert is an improvement over the tyranny. And it's also a very strange story, because if you think about the story geographically, the desert that the Israelites were hypothetically wandering through isn't that big. And they're there for like 45 years, and you think, well, that's kind of a failure of leadership. It'd take like 2 weeks to walk across the desert, yet they're out there for 45 years or 40 years. What can that possibly mean? And what it means, I think, it means a variety of things, but apart from the fact that it's out of the tyranny into the desert, which is really something to think about. Like, why won't you drop your stubborn preconceptions if they're just constraining you, you know? Or why would people subject themselves to totalitarian oppression if they could just let it go and then everything would be all right? And the answer is, everything wouldn't be all right. It might get worse initially. And that's sort of what seems to happen in the Exodus story. It's like in the desert. And how long? 40 years, 3 generations. So you might think, well, we were better off in the bloody tyranny. And lots of times, we've seen this in the modern world, there were no shortage of people in the Soviet Union once the Soviet Union collapsed, even after the terrible 1990s, who were what would you call it? Reminisced fondly about the good old Stalinist days. And you can kind of understand that, because maybe knowing exactly what you should be doing all the time is preferable to not knowing what the hell's going on ever. And maybe that's the distinction between the tyranny and the desert. You know, you drop the tyranny, but then what? Well, what happens in the desert? The Israelites are wandering around there for like decades, and they fight amongst themselves. And Moses has to act as a judge. I won't get into that too much, but he judges them for a very long period of time, for many, many hours every day, trying to help them regulate their behavior now that they don't have a central authority. They also become faithless. That the story insists upon this, that they lose their faith in the God that called them out of Egypt. And so you could say they lose faith. This is one way of thinking about it. They lose faith in the principle of freedom. And it's not that surprising, because now they're free. They're in the desert, and so that's kind of rough. And so why wouldn't they continue with their faith in the God that called them to freedom? It says, well, look where you brought us. This isn't so good. And then they start to worship false idols. And that's relevant to tonight's topic of discussion, because we're talking about ideology, right? I said abandon ideology. It's the same idea, false idols. What makes an idol false? The Israelites are thinking, well, God and his desire for freedom brought us to this desert. How about a new God? You know, one that's not so annoying, let's say. And so that's all well and good, and they start worshiping all sorts of different idols, golden calf, for example, and they're having a fine old time of it, fractionating into their multiple groups of belief, worshiping false idols. I should make just a side note about what worship means, because it's a weird word. And I would say, you know, if you hero worship someone, then you want to be like them. And so worship has that fundamental element of mimicry. And so that's tied nicely to this notion that what you believe is what you act out, not what you say is true. And so to worship something is to be compelled by the desire to imitate it. You know, you might say, well, if you're a big fan of a star, someone make a joke near you and say, well, you worship that person. It's like, well, it's not exactly a joke. The grip of that admiration is part of the impetus to imitate. And so then I would say, well, just as what you value most highly is that which you act out, what you worship is that which compels you to imitate. That's what the act of worship means. To imitate and to celebrate. To celebrate is to put at the highest place. To say this is the highest of values. And so now the Israelites are out in the desert and they're worshiping false idols, which means they're putting the wrong thing in the highest place. And then we have the same objection. How do you know that it's the wrong thing? Which is the same question. How do you know when a belief is an ideological belief and when it's valid? Or can you even say such a thing? And how do you know when you're saying it that you're not just falling into the same trap? I'm trying to puzzle that out piece by piece. I want to tell you a side story here, then we'll go back to the narrative. A couple of side stories. On the back of your dollar bill, there's a pyramid. And at the top of the pyramid, there's a cap, and the cap is separated from the pyramid, and there's an eye in the cap. Okay. And then in the Washington Monument, at the top of the Washington Monument, there's a pyramid, and at the top of the pyramid, there's a cap, and it's made out of aluminum. In ancient Egypt, that cap was made out of gold. And the reason it's made out of aluminum in Washington is because aluminum was more expensive than gold when the Washington Monument was made, and they wanted to make the cap of the pyramid, which is the thing at the very top of the pyramid. They wanted to make it out of the most valuable material. Now, why would you want to make what's at the top of the pyramid out of what's most valuable? And the answer to that is something like, the thing that's at the top of the pyramid, since it's at the top, should be the thing that's most valuable. And what's most valuable? Well, gold's valuable. Why? Well, it's like the sun. It's incorruptible. It's a noble metal. It gleams like the sun. It's a symbol of value. And so the notion there is that the thing that's at the very pinnacle of the pyramid should be the thing that's most valuable. And then we're back to the question. How do you know that something is valuable compared to something else? Okay, so put that aside, back to the Exodus story. So the Israelites are worshiping all these false idols, and God's getting upset about this. And he sends a bunch of poisonous snakes in amongst the Israelites to bite them. And which seems kind of heavy-handed, you might say, because the poor Israelites, they're thinking, tyranny, desert, snakes, you know, enough. And fair enough, you know, I have all sorts of sympathy for their position, because out of the tyranny into the desert, that's no joke. And then to add snakes to that seems like too much. But doesn't matter, because you'll find yourself in your life at times when you've gone out of the tyranny into the desert and you're suffering plenty, and then the snakes come and you're suffering even more. And well, the Israelites get together and they go to Moses. They get together and they think, okay, enough snakes. We'll repent. They go to Moses and they say, look, we get it. Can you have a chat with God? Get him to call off the snakes. And so Moses says, I'll see what I can do. And he goes and has a chat with God. And he says, you know, you're stiff-necked people. It's a reference to the Pharaoh. Repent. Do you think you could do something about the snakes? And God has a perfect opportunity there to just get rid of the snakes, since he brought them. But that isn't what happens. And that's extremely strange, at least. Now, I'm not going to claim that what I am going to tell you that I think it means is what it means, because who knows these things. But I think we could all agree that at the very least, that's very strange. The whole story is strange, but that's strange. Moses goes to God. He says, you could call off the snakes, and God doesn't. He says something almost incomprehensible. Instead, he says, you should take Moses already has a staff. It's the staff of Moses, and he's done all sorts of magic tricks with it before, like turning it into a snake and having it turn back into a staff. And I won't get into that. That's a very interesting idea in and of itself. But God tells Moses' staff is also the staff of God. It's the thing that Moses relies on. It's, in some sense, it's the thing he can lean on. And so the staff is something you can lean on. And when you're walking, of course, the staff helps you stand and walk. And so it's a support. It's something reliable. Anyways, God tells Moses, take the staff and cast it in bronze, and then cast a snake in bronze, so make a sculpture, and stick the snake on the staff and put the staff in the ground, and then have the Israelites go look at the snake. And if they do that, then they won't be poisoned when they get bitten. And you think, what the hell is going on with that story? It's like, it's so peculiar. You know, this is one of those situations with the story. You think there's either something deep going on here, or it's completely, I don't know what your conclusion can be. It's incomprehensibly strange, but that's the story. And so anyways, the Israelites go and they look at the snake, and then they're not poisoned anymore. And then here's even a weirder twist on that story. So many thousands of years later, Christ says, according to the Gospels, that he has to be lifted up like the snake Moses hung on the staff in the desert, which takes a story that's already unbelievably peculiar and makes it way more peculiar. Because you think, well, why in the world would someone who is reputed to be the savior of humanity, regardless of whether or not you believe that, why would he associate himself with a snake? And then, especially given, the reputation of the snake, and more particularly, why associate himself with the particular snake that Moses used because God told him to in the desert? It's another one of those situations where there's either something going on here that's extremely mysterious, or what is it? What is it? Is it a kind of insanity? It's not obvious at all what to do with that story. But here's what you do with it if you're a clinical psychologist, or if you're me and you're a clinical psychologist. One of the things we have learned is that we've learned a couple of things as clinicians, let's say. Here's one: honest speech cures people. Right? So Freud, in some sense, was the first person to really formulate that clinically. He said, come to my practice, and you can lay on this couch, and you just say whatever comes into your mind with zero censorship. And the consequence of that will be your thoughts will weave a pathway to your problems, which will then reveal themselves in a manner that, in principle, allows you to, for Freud, express the emotion associated with the problem and be cured as a consequence. Now, I don't think Freud had that right, because it's not the expression of the emotion that's curative, but it is the case that clinicians have agreed that untrammeled speech, so that would be free speech, except in the clinical setting, is in fact curative. And you kind of know that, right? Because you have people around you, perhaps, that you can tell the truth to, and vice versa. And there are times when, well, all the time, that might be painful because they tell the truth, and so do you, but it's really helpful, and sometimes it's absolutely bloody necessary, right? Especially if you're in trouble, because you want someone that you can tell the truth to who will return the favor. And because thought is associated with adaptation, then true thought is going to be associated with redemption. So the truth sets you free in that regard. And so that's one thing that clinicians have all converged on, regardless of their school of clinical endeavor. And here's another. If you voluntarily confront what you're afraid of, you get braver. And so the behavior therapists, the Freudians figured this out a bit, because they would have you revisit trauma that occurred earlier in your life. And that's a pretty common therapeutic technique. We should talk about those things that still plague you emotionally. I don't think we should talk about them so that you get to express the associated emotion. I think we should talk about them so you figure out how it was that you were vulnerable enough so that you got hurt, and then figure out how to not have that happen anymore. I think that's really the conclusion of a century's worth of clinical practice. But the other conclusion is, you face what you're afraid of voluntarily, you get better. So if people have a phobia of elevators, they're agoraphobic, you can teach them slowly to approach an elevator and to open it and to go inside it, and their fear of the elevator will radically decrease. And their fear of many other things will decrease simultaneously, because it turns out that when you face the things you're afraid of voluntarily, you don't get less afraid. You get braver. And that's better than less afraid, because imagine if it's just less afraid, you'd have to expose yourself to every single thing you were ever afraid of, in order to become less afraid. But if you got braver, you just expose yourself to some of the things that, that intimidate you, and there'd be a growth of personality as a consequence of that, and then you'd be better off in facing all of the things you're afraid of. Well, that's what happens in the desert. So there's this weird idea, and I don't know what to make of it exactly, but you can see what you can make of it. God could have just called off the snakes, but he seems to have made a decision that no, the snakes are there and there's nothing that can be done about them, but you can make people a hell of a lot better than they are. And one of the ways you do that is by encouraging them to voluntarily confront the things they're afraid of.
The empirical viewpoint is in some sense that what you know as a consequence of sense data. And the problem with that proposition is that there is mystery embedded inside the axiomatic presupposition of sense data. So behavioral psychologists believe that animals, and they tried to model animal behavior using these a priori theory, the animal reacted reflexively to a stimulus. And so that's a deterministic machine hypothesis. And that always bothered me, partly because animals don't do that. So for example, if you train a rat to run down a maze, it'll learn how to run down the maze. And then if you bind the legs, back legs of the rat, and you put its rear end on a wheeled chariot, it will propel itself through the maze on the wheels. And obviously it didn't learn that reflexively because there aren't that many wheeled rats. And they just don't have that kind of experience. And so the rat's perfectly capable of modifying what it learned in this hypothetically deterministic manner to react to an entirely different set of challenges and come up with exactly the same solution. There was an old behaviorist joke that under controlled laboratory conditions, an animal will do exactly what it damn well pleases. And I like that very much. And the problem with the behaviorist theory of stimulus response was the axiomatic presupposition that the stimulus was given. That you just look at the world and there's the stimulus right in front of you, that takes no effort, and you merely respond reflexively to it. And that's so wrong that it's almost incalculable, because it turns out that perceiving the world is so complex that in some real sense, not only do we not know how we do it, but it looks impossible. And part of the reason that it's impossible, and this is again why empiricism is an incomplete theoretical account of the genesis of knowledge, is that there are literally, or close enough to literally, an infinite number of ways to look at anything. And that's because everything is not only complex in and of itself, at the microcosmic level, almost beyond imagination, but that everything is also situated in a context, which is actually a determining element of the nature of the thing, and the context, expanded enough, actually takes everything into account. And so that makes perception a very weird phenomenon. For another reason, I was always amused, for example, when I traveled with my family when I was young, on our summer vacations, we used to do things like get out and look at the border between Canada and the United States. And that's a very weird thing to do, because you can actually do it, and you can step across it, and people treat that as if it's magic in some sense, because part of us knows that that border is not there, right? It's not a part of the objective world, and yet, well, and yet it is, because there you are standing beside it. And then if you look at aerial views, you can see the farmers' fields end exactly where the border is. And so things like borders between countries inhabit this weird space between the objective and the subjective that's a magic space. And it actually turns out that almost everything we perceive has that degree of magicality about it. I've thought also about such things as people's proclivity to go to museums, maybe in Nashville, for example, or Memphis, to go look at Elvis Presley's guitar. And you think, well, what exactly are you looking at when you go look at Elvis Presley's guitar? Because first of all, it's a mass-produced guitar, and so why not just look at another guitar? And you think, well, that's not the same thing. It's like, well, why isn't it the same thing? Because it's not. And the reason is that the guitar is not merely something, and this is the thing you perceive, it's not merely something made up of the guitar atoms, let's say, in the guitar molecules. It's also an artifact that was embedded in a context across a period of time. And that embeddedness of that artifact is part of what you perceive when you see an artifact like a celebrity, something a celebrity owned, or the relic of a saint, let's say. And so, and you can say, well, that's all an overlay on top of perception, and that would be fine, except that's wrong. There's no data, so to speak, that support that viewpoint. That's not how perception works. Perception is unbelievably complicated. So we see regularities of being, and some of those, impediments and affordances is the technical term, we tend to perceive as objects. But we also see the possibilities of being. But the problem with that is that the world of objects, potentially relevant objects, and the world of possibility is vast beyond our comprehension. And so then we have another problem that emerges as a consequence of that, which is a key and signal problem, And the fact that it has been solved precipitously and carelessly, hastily, is actually the reason for the culture war that's raging today. And that is that we have to prioritize our perceptions. We have to prioritize our perceptions to get access to the sense data that hypothetically informs us. We have to see the world through a system of value. And why would I say a system of value? Well, a system of value is a system of priorities, right? Because to value something is to make it more important than other things that it's being compared to. And why do you need a hierarchy of perceptual priority in order to see? And the answer is, well, you can't see everything at once. And so you can only see one thing at a time. And which thing? And the answer is the thing you think is most important to see at that moment. And then the question is, well, and this is the question, why is that the most important thing to see at the moment? So imagine, this is true in the auditory domain, in the tactile domain, all sensory domains. And you think that perception is a passive action and that we act upon the consequences of our perception, and this is just not true at all. There's no level of the analysis of perception neurophysiologically where you can separate action from perception. So for example, when you're looking at the world, although you don't know this, your eyes are moving back and forth very, very quickly. They have to move. If they stop moving for more than 1/10 of a second, you go blind because you saturate the neurons that you're using to perceive so intensely with the repetitive stimulation that they just shut down. And so at a micro level, your eyes are vibrating like mad, and then there are saccades above that that are still unconscious, that are less rapid and wider, and then voluntarily, you have voluntary eye fields in the frontal cortex, you move your eyes voluntarily to point to what you want to see, and you do that because the center part of your vision is exceptionally high resolution. Each center vision foveal neuron is connected directly to 10,000 neurons in the primary visual cortex, and then each of those 10,000 is connected to another 10,000. It's very expensive neurophysiological real estate, and if all of your vision was as intensely high resolution as your fovea, which is a very small part of your retina, you'd have to have a brain like an alien.